These are T30s.
Now working on the Supercharger gasket bolts. These are also T30s, and I'll just speed up the footage here to make it go a little bit faster. These are very easy to take apart.
Alright, these are T30s, starting with the front fascia removal. Okay, there's some Phillips under here. These 8mm bolts out. There's one on either side, and they're accessed from underneath. Now there's a row of 10mm nuts underneath the bumper. And one Phillips. As long as everything's free. I'm going to detach our lights at this point. Then there is a temperature sensor in the middle. Oh, and then there's marker lights on the side. Right here's the temperature sensor. And then we'll just pull it out completely. Now we need to remove the 4 nuts and 1 bolt on either side of the bumper support.
We'll get ready to drain the coolant from the radiator. There's no drain plug, so in order to do this you have to remove the lower radiator hose. So here I'm just removing the clip, don't remove the hose yet. It'll be easier to do that from above once we get some separation. There are 4 plastic retainers in each wheel well towards the front that you need to remove in order to get the front end to separate. A lot of times these are clogged up with dirt and road grime, so if you kind of get some resistance on them with like a trim tool, as I'm doing here, they'll come out a lot easier. Other times you may have to just sort of pop them out with force. A lot of times the Phillips hole will strip out on these as well, and I'll show you how you can repair that on reassembly. Working on the crash tubes now, there's one on each side. There's a single 10mm bolt in the front, and underneath are 13s. And disconnect the electrical connection that goes to the horn on each side. You should go to the hardware store and get some M8 by 1.25 bolts. Get them as long as you can. I think these are 100mm. About 4 inches is sufficient. You can release the air intake clamp with a flathead screwdriver. Now just slide the modular front end out onto the bolts. It gives you a lot more access. I'm just pulling up on the lower radiator hose that we loosened earlier. Removing the reservoir cap will make the coolant drain better. With more access, it's easier to remove the driving light bulbs if you have them. Before we remove the plastic front end, you'll want to fish the wires through the holes on each side so they're clear. And now you want to release the fan electrical connector. This is a 10mm bolt that holds the AC port and bracket. Just removing the upper radiator hose now. You don't have to remove the condenser, but I find it's easier to work around the front of the car if you're just dealing with moving the condenser out of the way. You get the fan and the plastic front end off. And there we go. Just go ahead and dump out the rest of your coolant. And I'm removing the hose clamp at the throttle body. I find it is easiest to remove the airbox hoses as an assembly from the valve cover connection. You just twist the bottom hose to get it out of the box. Now you'll need to remove the driver's side intercooler bracket from the horn. Here I remove the upper clip on the hose that goes to the lower radiator. These 45-degree long nose pliers from Harbor Freight are very helpful for this. There are three 10mm nuts that hold the horn to the supercharger that need removed. Remove the two 8mm bolts that hold the bracket onto the throttle body section. It's necessary to release this lower hose clamp in order to give enough movement to remove the horn from supercharger. This is a 13mm bolt holding the lower bracket on the oil dipstick tube, and also the upper 13mm. You just have to wiggle and pull straight up to get the tube out. Replace the O-ring and shoot it with some silicone spray to make installation easier. You really must have one of these Cooper S tensioner tools. There are two stubs that insert into the tensioner and then pivot on the 13mm supercharger bolt. You then insert a pin into one of the second or third notches on the tensioner, and that allows you to then release the tool. just starting to work on the 13mm bolts that hold the supercharger in. I start with this one on the right and then do two on the upper left, and then I start to work on the one in the side that goes through the tensioner. Now we're going to get the alternator out of the way. Just getting the electrical connection here. They just push and pull. Have a block of wood ready, and you can just rest the alternator on that. That way you don't have to unscrew the electrical line. I forgot there's one last hose here that needs removed in order to pull the supercharger. Have your bucket ready underneath the front of the engine, and also be sure you plug the dipstick tube hole with something before you do this.
This is 3/16 Allen. Nothing. Okay, this side takes 2 ounces of fluid. The bottle is 4, so I want to do about half the bottle.
I'm just making 6 ounces total here for the pulley side by adding half of the bottle to a full one. Here we're replacing the O-ring on the water pump. And it's a good idea to shoot this with some silicone too, to make it slide in better.
There's an O-ring back here we need to replace as well. You can see this one is pretty flat.
Now it's recommended that you not fully tighten the bracket on the engine block at this point. You should reinstall the supercharger and bolt it down fully, allowing this bracket to move into the correct position. I wasn't sure I'd be able to reach these two bolts with the supercharger installed, but in fact you can reach them through the water pump bracket without any issue. Moving on to the oil pan gasket, now's a good time to drain the oil. We have to get the AC compressor out of the way as it's attached to the oil pan. You'll need to disconnect the electrical connection that goes to the crank sensor. These are 10mm nuts that hold the power steering fan. Just one electrical connection to release here. Now using a breaker bar we can release the 17mm bolt that connects an engine mount to the oil pan. There are two 13mm bolts on the side that need taken out. So work your way around the oil pan, removing all the bolts except for one. I'm just going to put a jack under the pan before I remove the last bolt. Use some brake clean to clean up the mating surface. The gasket has some tabs on it that'll hold it in place while you move the pan into position.
The pan bolts get 31 Newton meters.
You can see here we need to follow a spiral pattern in order to tighten the oil pan bolt.